The smoke that rose from Smithfield on the 5th of April, 1531, was of a different character than usual. It was not the greasy, acrid smoke of burning heretics, a sight Londoners were becoming grimly accustomed to. Nor was it the familiar haze of 1,000 domestic hearths and commercial forges. This smoke was thin, almost vaporous, carrying on the chill spring air a scent so foul, so deeply unsettling, that it defied description. It was the smell of cooked flesh, of human fat rendered by boiling water. At the center of the thronged square, a great iron cauldron, typically used for laundry or brewing, had been set over a blazing fire. A gibbet-like structure loomed over it, complete with a heavy chain and pulley. This was the stage for a new kind of horror, a punishment so bizarre and so cruel that it seemed torn from the darkest pages of some forgotten, barbaric law code. The man at the heart of this spectacle, the man whose screams would soon curdle the blood of all who heard them, was not a nobleman, a traitorous lord, or a seditious priest. He was Richard Roos, a cook, and his agonizing end raises a question that cuts to the very core of power, paranoia, and justice in the age of Henry VIII. How does a simple kitchen worker, accused of a single, confused act, become the subject of a unique and monstrous law, personally driven by the King of England, and meet his end in a manner designed for maximum theatrical suffering? To understand the gruesome fate of Richard Roos, one must first understand that he was a man immolated not merely by fire and water, but by the furious collision of immense historical forces. His story is not his own. It belongs to his master, the pious and unbending Bishop John Fisher, and even more so, to his king Henry Tudor. Roos was a minor character who stumbled onto the main stage during the final act of a national drama, and for his mistake, he was devoured by the plot. The England of 1531 was a kingdom holding its breath, a nation balanced on the knife edge of schism. For years, the central, obsessive project of the government had been the king's great matter, Henry VIII's desperate quest to annul his marriage of over 2 decades to Catherine of Aragon. The reason was twofold. Catherine had failed to produce a male heir, leaving the fledgling Tudor dynasty perilously insecure, and Henry had become utterly infatuated with the captivating, sharp-witted, and Boleyn, who refused to be his mistress and demanded to be his queen. This was not merely a matter of the royal bedchamber. It was a crisis that threatened to unravel the entire political and religious fabric of the realm. The Pope, Clement VII, was effectively a prisoner of Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and was therefore unable and unwilling to grant the annulment. Henry, a man whose colossal ego was matched only by his deep-seated belief in his own divine right, found this opposition intolerable. He was the King of England, second only to God. The idea that a foreign pontiff could deny him what he saw as his right, a legitimate heir and a new wife, was an insult that festered into a cancerous rage. At the heart of the opposition to the kings stood a handful of towering figures, men of unimpeachable integrity whose defiance could not be easily dismissed. Chief among them was Bishop John Fisher of Rochester. Fisher was a relic of a different age, a man of profound learning and severe, ascetic piety. He had been a confessor to Henry's own grandmother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, and had been appointed to his see by Henry's father. He was a prince of the church, a cardinal, and a scholar of international renown. To Henry, Fisher represented an infuriating obstacle. He was the most vocal and articulate defender of Queen Catherine's cause, arguing her case with unassailable theological rigor and moral force. He saw the king's desire for an annulment not as a matter of state necessity, but as a simple case of adultery, a capitulation to lust that threatened the sanctity of marriage and the authority of the Holy See. Fisher's opposition was not just academic. It was personal and public. In a legate in court of 1529, he had spoken with the fire of a prophet, comparing himself to John the Baptist, who had lost his head for speaking out against the king's unlawful marriage. It was a comparison that was as brave as it was foolhardy, a direct challenge to a monarch who did not suffer challenges lightly. By 1531, Fisher was a marked man, living in the shadow of the king's displeasure. He and his household in Lambeth were an island of defiant orthodoxy in a sea of encroaching reform and royal supremacy. Into this charged and dangerous environment steps Richard Roos. We know painfully little about him. He was a cook, one of many servants in the bustling household of a prominent bishop. He was likely illiterate, his world circumscribed by the heat of the kitchens, the ordering of supplies, and the hierarchy of domestic service. He was, in the grand scheme of things, a nobody. His name would have been lost to history, like those of millions of his contemporaries, had he not, on one fateful day, decided to add a white powder to a large pot of pottage simmering on the fire. Pottage, a thick soup or porridge, was a staple of the English diet, consumed by everyone from the lord of the manor to the humblest servant. The pot in Fisher's kitchen was enormous, for the bishop was known for his charity. Not only did it need to feed his extensive household and guests, but the leftovers were traditionally distributed to the poor who gathered at his gates each day. It was an act of Christian piety that would, on this day, have devastating consequences. The event took place on February 18th, 1531. The bishop's palace at Lambeth was full, with various guests and members of the household expecting their dinner. In the kitchens, Richard Roos approached the bubbling cauldron. He later claimed, in the confession that was tortured out of him, that his intentions were malicious, but not murderous. He allegedly intended the powder to act as a powerful purgative, a sort of cruel practical joke designed to incapacitate his fellow servants, to give them a scouring that would leave them miserable and unable to work. This explanation, while bizarre, is not entirely implausible in an era where rough humor and crude pranks were commonplace. He insisted that he never meant to harm the bishop or his guests, and certainly not to kill anyone. He had simply misjudged the nature of the substance he possessed. But his actions, whatever their intent, set in motion a chain of events that would lead him directly to the boiling cauldron at Smithfield. The pottage was served. As it happened, Bishop Fisher himself ate little or none of it that day. A contemporary account suggests he felt unwell and had no appetite, a small twist of fate that likely saved his life. His guests, however, were not so fortunate. They ate, and soon after, the horrific effects began. The victims were seized with violent vomiting, their stomachs churning, their bodies contorting in agony. The household was thrown into chaos and panic as people collapsed, writhing on the floor. But the real tragedy unfolded outside the gates. The leftovers of the poisoned meal were distributed, as was the custom, to the local poor who relied on the bishop's charity for their survival. For them, this offering of food was a blessing. Today, it was a death sentence. They took the pottage back to their hovels, shared it with their families, and they too began to die. 2 individuals perished in excruciating pain, a gentleman named Bennet Kerwin and a poor widow, Alice Trippitt. Many others were left grievously ill. News of the incident spread through London like wildfire, sparking terror and outrage. Poison was a crime that evoked a particular kind of dread in the 16th century. It was the weapon of assassins, of Italians and schemers, a secret, cowardly method of murder that could strike down anyone, no matter how powerful or well-guarded. For a monarch like Henry VIII, who was already beginning to see enemies behind every tapestry, the idea of poison being used in the household of a prominent bishop was nothing short of terrifying. If a man like John Fisher, a prince of the church, could be targeted in his own home, then who was safe? The king, whose own father had seized the throne through force of arms, was acutely aware of the precariousness of power. He lived with the constant, nagging fear of assassination, a fear that would grow into a full-blown paranoia that defined the latter half of his reign. The Lambeth poisoning was not just a crime. It was a threat, a terrifying omen. Henry's reaction was immediate, personal, and utterly overwhelming. He did not leave the matter to the ordinary courts of justice. He seized upon it himself, transforming a criminal investigation into an affair of state. Richard Roos was quickly identified and arrested. He was taken not to a common jail, but to the Tower of London, a place reserved for prisoners of the highest political significance. There, in the cold stone chambers designed to break the will of princes and rebels, the cook was subjected to interrogation. The official accounts state that he confessed his guilt without being put to the torture of the rack. This claim is highly suspect. The tower's interrogators were masters of coercion, and the very threat of the rack, with its power to stretch and dislocate a man's limbs, was often enough to secure any confession desired. Roos confessed to the story of the joke gone wrong, admitting he put the powder in the pottage. But under the immense pressure and terror of his situation, his confession was likely shaped to fit the narrative his captors wanted to hear. The king, however, was not satisfied. A simple murder charge, even for two people, was insufficient. The crime, in his mind, was far greater. He saw in this act a direct assault on the social order, an attack on a public figure that was tantamount to an attack on the state itself. It was, he decided, a form of treason. This was a radical and legally unprecedented interpretation. Treason traditionally involved plotting against the king's life, levying war against him, or aiding his enemies. To classify a domestic poisoning, however tragic, as high treason was a breathtaking legal leap, one that demonstrated the king's willingness to bend the entire legal system to his will and his emotions. He was determined to make an example of Richard Roos, to create a spectacle of punishment so terrifying that no one would ever dare contemplate such a crime again. To achieve this, Henry took the extraordinary step of going before Parliament himself. In late February 1531, he addressed the House of Lords, his famous bulk filling the chamber, his voice thundering with manufactured rage and genuine fear. He presented the case of Richard Roos not as a matter for a jury, but as a direct threat to the entire peerage. He argued that the cowardly and secret nature of poison made it a unique evil that required a unique punishment. The existing penalties for murder, hanging, were too good for such a villain. A poisoner, he argued, should suffer a death that reflected the slow, agonizing nature of his crime. He proposed a new law, a bill of attainder that would bypass a formal trial and declare Roos guilty by an act of Parliament. And this act would contain a new and terrible clause. The punishment for poisoning would henceforth be death by boiling. The bill, which would become known as the Act for Poisoning, is a chilling document. It is a piece of ex post facto legislation, meaning it made Roos's act punishable by a law that did not exist when he committed it. This violated a fundamental principle of justice. Yet Parliament, cowed by the king's fury and perhaps sharing his terror of assassination, quickly acquiesced. The act declared that Richard Roos, of his most wicked and damnable disposition, did cast a certain venom or poison into a vessel replenished with yeast or barm, with which certain pottage was made. It explicitly condemned him to be committed to execution of death by boiling for the same. The law was not just for Roos. It was to be the standard punishment for all poisoners in the future, a permanent addition to the Tudor state's arsenal of terror. The Lords and Commons passed it without significant dissent. Who would dare to speak against the king's righteous anger, especially when the victims were a gentleman and a poor widow, and the target might have been a bishop? The legality of the act was dubious, but its political message was crystal clear. It was a demonstration of Henry's absolute power. He could not only declare a man guilty without trial, but he could literally invent a new form of execution to suit his own sense of justice and his own anxieties. The choice of boiling was not random. It was a punishment with a dark, almost theatrical quality. It was slow. It was public. It ensured maximum suffering and maximum visibility. Hanging was a quick, almost clinical affair by comparison. A man dropped, his neck snapped, and it was over. But to be lowered into boiling water was to experience an agony that the mind could scarcely comprehend, and to do so in full view of a horrified crowd, whose nightmares would be filled with the sight and sound for weeks to come. This was not justice. This was royal terror, a carefully choreographed performance designed to project the image of an omnipotent and wrathful king. The question of conspiracy lingered in the air, unspoken in Parliament, but whispered in the corridors of power. Was Richard Roos acting alone, or was he a pawn in a much deadlier game? The most obvious target of the poison was Bishop Fisher. And who had the most to gain from Fisher's death? The factions surrounding and Bullen. By 1531, they were growing increasingly frustrated by the old bishop's stubborn opposition to the king's annulment. Eliminating him would remove a major obstacle. It was rumored that Anne's own father, Thomas Bullen, Earl of Wiltshire, had expressed a wish that Fisher were dead. Could Roos have been hired by the Bullens or their agents to assassinate the bishop, only to bungle the attempt? Or perhaps the plot was even more sinister. Some have speculated that the attempt was designed to fail, to cast suspicion on Fisher himself, to make it appear as though he had poisoned his own household in a bizarre bid for sympathy, thereby discrediting him. There is no concrete evidence for any of these theories. Richard Roos himself, even under duress, never implicated anyone else. The simplest explanation, and the one he stuck to, is that he was a fool who committed a reckless and catastrophic prank. But in the paranoid atmosphere of Henry's court, where plots and counterplots were the currency of politics, the specter of a wider conspiracy was impossible to ignore. It added another layer of darkness to the proceedings, suggesting that Roos was not just a criminal, but a convenient scapegoat whose execution served to bury a dangerous and inconvenient truth. Regardless of the truth behind the crime, the sentence was now law. For over a month, Richard Roos languished in the Tower, awaiting his unprecedented fate. One can only imagine the psychological torment he endured. He was an uneducated man caught in the terrifying machinery of the state, condemned by the king himself, his death sentence read aloud in the highest court in the land. He knew that he was not just going to die, but that he was going to be the subject of a horrifying public experiment in punishment. He was a man marked not just for death, but for agony. On the morning of April 5th, 1531, the final act of this tragedy began. Roos was taken from the Tower and conveyed through the streets of London to Smithfield. Smithfield was a large, open space just outside the city walls, a traditional site for markets and, most grimly, executions. A large crowd had already gathered, drawn by the morbid novelty of the event. They were a cross-section of London society. Merchants, apprentices, housewives, beggars, and cut-purses, all jostling for a better view of the monstrous apparatus that had been erected in the center of the square. The cauldron steamed ominously over its roaring fire. The executioner and his assistants, their faces grim, stood ready. The air was thick with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Richard Roos was brought forth, bound and likely manacled. A contemporary chronicler, William Gregory, described the scene with chilling brevity. He wrote that Roos was fastened to a chain and pulled up and down in the boiling water with a pulley until he was dead. This simple description hides a world of unimaginable suffering. He was not simply thrown in. The method was designed to prolong the process, to maximize the horror for both the victim and the spectator. He would have been lowered into the scalding water, then perhaps hoisted out, then lowered again. His screams, the chronicler noted, were roaring mighty loud. The initial shock of the boiling water on his skin would have been indescribable, an explosion of pure, searing pain that would overwhelm the senses. His skin would have blistered and peeled away from the flesh, his muscles cooked on his bones. The process would have been agonizingly slow. It was not the quick death of snapped neck or a clean beheading. It was a death by inches, a slow, torturous dissolution of the human body. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their morbid curiosity likely turning to revulsion and horror. This was not the righteous spectacle of a heretic burning for his sins, an event that could be framed in the comforting language of religious purification. This was something raw, something primal and visceral. It was the calculated, mechanical destruction of a human being in the most painful way imaginable. The sight, the sounds, and especially the smell, the sickeningly sweet and foul odor of cooking human flesh, would have been seared into the memory of everyone present. It was a message from the king, delivered not in ink on parchment, but in steam and screams and rendered fat. The message was simple: I am the king. My will is law. Defy me, or threaten the order that I embody, and I can devise for you a fate worse than death itself." After what must have seemed an eternity, Richard Roos's roars faded to whimpers and then to silence. His body, boiled and disfigured beyond recognition, was finally pulled from the cauldron. His part in the drama was over. He was an object lesson, a piece of political theater, and his remains were likely disposed of with little ceremony in an unmarked grave. He had served his purpose. The king's rage had been sated, his authority demonstrated, and his new, terrible law had been christened in the most dramatic fashion possible. The immediate aftermath of Roos's execution saw the act for poisoning become a grim, if rarely used, part of the English legal landscape. It was a loaded gun that the state kept in its armory. It would be used at least once more, in 1542, to execute a young maidservant named Margaret Davy, who had poisoned her mistress. The method remained the same: public boiling. The law itself, a monument to Henry's specific brand of tyranny, was only repealed in 1547, after his death, during the reign of his son Edward VI, as part of a general move to undo the most draconian excesses of the Henrician era. But its existence for 16 years stands as a testament to a time when the law was not a shield for the innocent, but a weapon for the powerful, a tool that could be forged and reforged in the fires of a king's personal anxieties. As for Bishop John Fisher, he was spared for now. He had survived the potential assassination attempt, only to see the man accused of it die in the most horrific manner. The event must have been a chilling warning to him. It demonstrated the lengths to which the king would go, the brutality he was capable of unleashing when he felt threatened or defied. Fisher, however, was not a man to be intimidated. His convictions were absolute, his faith unshakable. He continued to oppose the king's break with Rome, refusing to accept the act of supremacy that declared Henry the head of the church in England. His defiance would ultimately cost him his life. In 1535, for years after Richard Roos was boiled alive, John Fisher was beheaded on Tower Hill, a martyr for the Catholic faith he refused to renounce. His fate, though different in method, was born of the same royal fury that had condemned his cook. In retrospect, the story of Richard Roos is a chilling case study in the anatomy of absolute power. It reveals a monarch so consumed by his own desires and fears that he could casually rewrite the law and invent new forms of cruelty to enforce his will. Henry VIII's public persona was that of a magnificent Renaissance prince, a defender of the faith, a lover of music and learning. But beneath the velvet and gold brocade was a man of terrifying volatility, whose personal insecurities and political frustrations could manifest as acts of spectacular, state-sanctioned violence. The boiling of Richard Roos was not the act of a stable, confident ruler. It was the act of a man deeply afraid of losing his dynasty, afraid of his political enemies, and, perhaps most of all, afraid of the silent, secret threat of poison. The historical debate over Roos's guilt continues. Was he a bungling prankster, a hapless fool whose joke went horribly wrong? Was he a would-be assassin in the employ of the Bullen faction, tasked with eliminating a key political opponent? Or was he simply a convenient scapegoat, an unimportant man sacrificed to serve the king's political agenda and quell his paranoia? The truth is buried with him. The confession extracted in the Tower is too tainted by the threat of torture to be taken at face value. The political context is too charged with intrigue to rule out a conspiracy. What remains is the stark, undeniable horror of his punishment. He stands as a grotesque symbol of the common man crushed by the great, impersonal forces of history. He was a footnote in the story of the English Reformation, a minor character in the saga of Henry and Anne. But his death, in all its calculated agony, tells us more about the true nature of Henry's regime than many of the grander chronicles of the age. The public spectacle of power has always been a tool of rulers, but the execution of Richard Roos represents a unique and particularly dark moment. It was a fusion of personal phobia and political expediency. The king's private fear of being poisoned became the justification for a public display of barbarism, a warning etched not in stone, but in the boiled flesh of a terrified cook. It serves as a profound and disturbing reminder that justice, when untethered from principle and placed in the hands of an absolute ruler, can become indistinguishable from vengeance. The law, which should be a fortress, can become a torture chamber, and the punishment can become a crime far greater than the one it purports to avenge. Richard Roos was condemned for taking 2 lives through his recklessness. The king, in response, created a law of calculated cruelty, a legal monstrosity designed not for justice, but for terror. And so the smoke that rose from Smithfield that day was not just the vapor of a man's life being extinguished. It was the foul steam of a legal system boiling over, its principles evaporating in the heat of a tyrant's rage.